In this video, I'll be talking about how to answer an exam question on gender in an inspector calls. Just a reminder that I tend to focus on the requirements of the Edexcel IGCSE English Literature exam, but this is also relevant for AQA students and other exam boards as well. So firstly, before we start, just a reminder of who J.B. Priestley is, because you will be expected to continually link back to his intentions as the playwright. So he was a socialist, and his aim really in writing an inspector calls was to undermine capitalism and the social class structure it creates, and therefore to promote socialism. And specifically when talking about gender, he tries to highlight the struggles of women, the exploitation they face, and the oppressive nature of the patriarchal system. Just a note that if you are sitting the AQA exams, you will be expected to talk about context in much more detail than I will in this video. A reminder for all of you that in your analysis, you should talk about language, form and structure. Language, basically the use of dialogue. Form, we're looking at the use of props, staging, lighting, stage directions, and then structure, things like repetition, contrast, and kind of the overall, I guess, arc of the story as well. Okay, so I advise that you would start with establishing the fact that this is set in a patriarchal society. This is 1912 England, when men held powerful positions. And we see this reflected in the men referenced, such as Alderman Megarty and Chief Constable Colonel Roberts, as well as the roles that Mr. Burling has held as Alderman, Lord Mayor, and he's still on the bench, which means he still has some sort of judicial capacity. This is in stark contrast to the women we see on stage. We see a housewife, a daughter, a maid, and we learn of Eva Smith, who is a factory worker turned shop assistant turned sex worker. All of these positions hold considerably less power. Priestley's really careful not to paint these men in power in a positive light. Alderman Megarty, as an example, is described as a notorious womanizer, and Gerald recalls how he forces himself on Eva Smith, wedging her into a corner. Sheila also describes a time when a girl escaped him with a torn blouse. All these anecdotes paint him in a predatory way, highlighting how he misuses his power, both socially and physically, to prey on vulnerable women. Although we do not hear about Chief Constable Colonel Roberts' antics, the fact that Mr. Burling feels he can use his name to intimidate the inspector implies that he is corrupt and would be willing to overlook criminal behaviour as a favour to Mr. Burling. And of course, the listing used by Mr. Burling to talk about these prominent roles he's held in society is really ironic. This man has considerable civic duty, but shows no sense of responsibility for the community he serves. So, of course, the main aim of Priestley in writing this was to expose the upper classes as morally bankrupt, and that's also regardless of gender, right? Because he also presents Mrs. Burling in a terrible way too. But it could be argued that he also raises a really important question, and that is, how does this society place so much power in the hands of men only? And being a socialist, he's promoting a society of equality, and that isn't just limited to not categorising people into social class, but also it's about creating a society that treats men and women equally. And then we see that that patriarchal society on a smaller scale within the Burling home where the play is set. Mr. Burling's monologues in Act 1 clearly establish him as the patriarch of the family. His word is held in much higher regard, and so are his feelings. Notice how he uses the first person pronouns I and me in a speech that is supposed to celebrate the engagement of Sheila and Gerald. It's clear that the marriage serves Mr. Burling much more than Sheila, as he goes on to explain the business opportunities it will afford him in uniting the Croft and Burling families, who have before this been business rivals. Despite being her husband's superior in social class, Mrs. Burling accepts that Mr. Burling is in charge in this household. You can see this in Act 3 when she tells the children, "Just be quiet so that your father can decide what we ought to do." This makes his position clear. The modal verb ought highlights how Mr. Burling is expected to direct the family's actions. The stage direction has Mrs. Burling looking at him expectantly, revealing her presupposition that Mr. Burling should be the one to make the decisions. It's important to note as well that in the stage directions at the beginning of the play, it's outlined that she is her husband's superior, but this clearly does not translate at home, and that, you could argue, highlights how gender supersedes class. I think this is a really important point to recognise in an essay focused on gender. So in other words, gender seems to be a more defining factor in determining the power one has. Because otherwise Mrs. Burling would be the one that calls the shots at home, but she doesn't. We see the effects of the kind of patriarchal system reflected in Sheila and Gerald's relationship also. When she receives her engagement ring, she asks, "Is it the one you wanted me to have?" The second person pronoun you indicates whose feelings are more important in this relationship, and it's Gerald's. And this places Sheila's desires as secondary to his. Here, Priestley's highlighting to a 1945 audience. Remember, this is set in 1912, but the first audience to have watched this on stage would have been in 1945. And what he's really doing here is saying to this audience who now have the female vote, they now have more women in the workforce, and he's saying to them, don't go back to 1912. Right? Remember the power imbalance between men and women. You need to be striving forward for greater gender equality. I then look at how women are underestimated. And you could argue it's unsurprising really that Mrs. Burling accepts the power imbalance between men and women, and actually so does Sheila, at least at the beginning of the play, because they are continually patronised. This is clear by the way the women are expected to leave the room so that the men can talk. It says there that Eric leaves, but he's just outside for a short moment and comes and joins the men. And so this indicates that women are perceived as to be too simple to be able to handle conversations about business and politics. And this is incredibly ironic, considering the waffle that comes out of Mr. Burling's mouth. For example, just giving you some ideas here, the Titanic is absolutely unsinkable. He says we're heading into a time of great prosperity. He says there's no chance of war. So that dramatic irony created in his dialogue encourages the audience to question, why do we simply assume that men have the authority on these topics? This is further exemplified in Act 2 by the way Gerald states, "I think Miss Burling ought to be excused any more of this questioning." By speaking on her behalf using the third person, he attempts to take away her agency. One could see actually why he was drawn to Eva Smith, because she's a vulnerable woman who could be controlled. But his patronising depiction of Sheila exposes actually how he underestimates her. She, more than anyone, can handle the truth. But he thinks that, basically talking about the details of his affair will be too difficult for her to hear. Furthermore, the inspector questions Gerald. He asks, "You think women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things?" To which Gerald says yes. The verb protected reflects how he perceives women as fragile and vulnerable and highly dependent on men. The irony is also not lost on the audience that Gerald should feel Sheila needs to be protected, yet he had little care for the vulnerabilities of Eva Smith. And that reveals the way women of a lower class are dismissed and treated significantly differently by upper class men. Let's not forget the real reason why Gerald wants Sheila to leave. And it's because he doesn't want her to hear the details of his affair. But he's kind of dressing this up as if he's her protector, and he tries to paint himself as some sort of hero, as this knight in shining armour. Priestley here is highlighting that women are underestimated in a patriarchal society, and he's making a case again for a socialist world that places equal importance on both men and women. Another way that women are undermined is the importance placed on their physical appearance. Mr. Burling explains how clothes mean something else to women. He says that they are a sort of sign or token of their self-respect. The declarative sentence gives Mr. Burling an air of expertise in his analysis of women, and the noun self-respect indicates that a woman's worth is derived by the trivial matter of how she looks. This is echoed by many characters in the play, not just Mr. Burling. When Sheila hears of a young girl that has died, her first questions are quite young and pretty, as if youth and good looks determine how tragic her death is. The men all comment on Eva Smith's appearance too. Mr. Burling notices that she's good looking, Gerald says that she's young and fresh and charming, and Eric describes her as pretty and a good sport. Good looks might help a woman of a higher class secure a so-called good marriage with an eligible bachelor, but for Eva, her good looks make her more vulnerable and a target. Looking at the language specifically, the adjective young depicts Eva as innocent and vulnerable, highlighting the exploitative nature of Gerald, but also that adjective fresh likens her to a piece of meat, reflecting the disregard upper-class men have of working-class women. Likewise, Eric's description of Eva as a good sport frames her as a form of entertainment for him. She's a casual game he likes to play when it suits him, with little regard to the consequences for her. Let's not forget that Eva Smith is also a target for other women as well. I haven't put this in here as a quote, but she is also fired from her job at the department store because Sheila is jealous of her prettiness. On the other hand, look at the disdain working class women face if they do not meet men's physical expectations. Gerald states, "I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women." Gerald's dialogue reflects his disgust in the sex workers emphasised by the harsh verb hate. By focusing on their physical appearance, he objectifies them and fails to recognise actually these clear signs of suffering. For example, their hard eyes reflect their harsh living conditions, and their dough faces are indicative of malnourishment. Priestley here really is highlighting the hypocrisy of the upper class. Gerald criticises these working class women for not looking pretty enough for him, but is quite happy to exploit their suffering for his own gains, both in business and in sexual gratification. I think it's really important to explore if you get a question on gender, to talk about the double standards that men and women are held to. It's highly ironic, as an example, that Gerald should be so judgmental of these sex workers, what we just talked about, when one might argue that his behaviour has been abhorrent. He describes his affair with Daisy Renton, otherwise known as Eva Smith, as inevitable. And this word inevitable is an attempt to normalise male infidelity and remove personal accountability. He's basically saying it's in his very nature as a hot-blooded male to be tempted by another pretty woman. His poor behaviour as well is defended by Mrs. Burling. This is really in relation to him going missing all summer. She tells Sheila, "You'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had." The use of future tense and declarative sentences creates an assured tone in which Mrs. Burling has a really clear and defined idea of the role of the wife. Basically, you have to keep quiet and stop complaining. Furthermore, the modal verb have to reveals Mrs. Burling's belief of a wife's obligation to her husband, suggesting that Sheila needs to take a passive role in their marriage because she's the woman. It's unknown whether Mrs. Burling knows that Gerald was having an affair. because she says this in Act 1 and that's not revealed until Act 2. But either way, it at least reveals that she doesn't challenge this marital dynamic, and what she's really doing is being submissive to the patriarchy. When Gerald's affair is known by all, it is still defended by Mr. Burling, of all people, as he starts to say to Sheila, you must understand that a lot of young men, and we can only imagine he's about to defend Gerald and basically say a lot of young men have affairs. Mr. Burling's reaction could be considered antithetical, basically the complete opposite of what one would expect from a father. The modal verb must creates a sense of urgency, reflecting that Mr. Burling is panicked in this moment because he realises that this marriage isn't going to happen. His instinct to defend Gerald rather than comfort and support his daughter really highlights the fact that his only concern for this engagement is the way that it benefits him, and he has no concern whatsoever on whether it actually makes Sheila happy. Considering this, Mr. Burling has a transactional view of their engagement, with Sheila being treated more like a bargaining chip than a daughter. It also raises questions regarding his own relationship with Mrs. Burling. His dismissiveness of Gerald's infidelity could suggest that Mr. Burling has behaved similarly. I'd say that even worse than normalising infidelity is the normalisation of violence against women. Eric, when talking about his interaction with Eva Smith, explains, I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty. The use of third person a chap distances himself from the action, with the noun ironically having connotations of friendliness. Most distressing is the euphemism used in nasty. Here, he avoids describing his threatening and coercive behaviour, which reflects a normalisation of male violence against women. Essentially, there is a strong hint here that he forced himself on her, and she feared what he might do next, so she let him into her apartment. Furthermore, there's this collectivisation, right? A chap. You know, I was in that state when a chap. So he's kind of collectivising his actions, saying this is quite normal, and that reflects the conventions of upper class society and the way men behave in this class. Now, contrast this, right? The dismissiveness of this male poor behaviour. I think that's an understatement to just say it's poor by men. Contrast that to the way Eva Smith is harshly judged by Mrs. Burling, as she states, she was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. We can take her position, that phrase, to relate to the fact that Eva Smith is an unwed expectant mother, something that would be greatly looked down upon in 1912. The verb claiming suggests a distrust in Eva Smith, and the adjectives elaborate and fine suggest that Mrs. Burling does not believe the poor are capable of complex emotions. I might even go as far to say she might think that even women aren't capable of such emotions. Her prejudice makes it impossible to understand or to feel compassion for Eva's position. And this is the antithesis, again, what I mean here is the direct opposite of what would be expected of someone on the board of a charity and a fellow woman. Where's your girl code? And highly hypocritical. It's highly hypocritical that she would be so judgmental of Eva Smith, yet so dismissive of Gerald's infidelity. And really, she brushes past Eric's coercive behaviour. She doesn't seem to be so concerned about that, more concerned about the fact that he stole money from the company. So it's clear here that there's a double standard for men and women, which is even more emphasised by the double standards as well as of the working class and the upper class. I think it's important to mention, and this kind of gives you a new, maybe a different aspect to your argument that many students won't explore, that the patriarchy also hurts men as well. I don't think this should be overlooked, and I think Eric is an excellent character to focus in on when making this point. So we have these repeated references to his alcoholism throughout the play, and the stage direction miserably suggests that Eric is deeply unhappy and he could be turning to drink to alleviate himself from his inner turmoil. This could be a result of his sense of discomfort in himself and the anxiety he feels around his family. And let's just remember, his own experience, his own background. He has grown up in a patriarchal household where his father undermines him at every turn. He constantly interrupts him, he criticizes him, and even makes jokes at his expense with Gerald. He's going to be expected to follow in his father's footsteps, no doubt, right? He'll be expected to run the family business, to become a breadwinner. And so one must question, does this constant undermining by his father prepare him to fulfill these high expectations that are placed on him due to this kind of capitalist society and this patriarchal society? Not to mention, he's also grown up in a world where he watches the men in power exploit young working class women. He's at the palace bar as well, watching the likes of Alderman Megati. And even, he witnesses his own father and Gerald and the way they exploit young working women in the workplace. He also hasn't witnessed a loving and equal relationship between his parents. So how does he even know what a healthy relationship looks like? Now, I've got to be clear here, I'm not excusing his coercive behaviour with Eva Smith by any means, but it raises an important question, which I think is what Priestley wanted to do. What kind of men does a patriarchal and capitalist society raise? And I think through Eric, Priestley highlights that even the most privileged can be victims of a society based on capital gains and gender inequality. There is, however, hope. There are many signs that the patriarchal system is challenged. Firstly, look at Eva Smith. She organises a strike in the workplace, and Mr. Burling describes her as having a lot to say, far too much. The adverbial phrase far too much places emphasis on his issue with her. According to him, the female working class should be silent, and he makes every effort to shut her voice down by letting her go. Being working class, Eva's efforts to challenge the capitalist and patriarchal system are limited, but we have greater hope, you might argue, in Sheila. She has more power, okay, and therefore potentially she can have more impact. Over the course of the play, the audience watch her gain more confidence and gain a greater sense of herself. A great example of this is when she returns the engagement ring to Gerald, and this is a great indicator that she considers herself his equal. She realises in this moment that she does deserve a loving relationship where her husband is honest and respectful towards her. Here, by returning that engagement ring, she rejects the patriarchal notion that women are lesser than men. Also, think about the way she is repeatedly referred to and described as acting hysterically throughout the play. This connotes to the trope characterising women as irrational and emotionally unstable. This stereotype was often used to oppress women and to undermine their thoughts and feelings. But what I love about Sheila is, even though she is described as that and by her family members, it doesn't hold her back. Rather than becoming more subdued, if you look at her stage directions, they become increasingly animated towards the end of the play. And so she doesn't care. She's not listening to them. That kind of trope was used to silence women, and she refuses to stay silent. She's unapologetically disgusted by her parents' attitude, and she will not back down on this. Eric is also united with his sister by the end of the play. He argues, the money's not the important thing. It's what happened to the girl and what we did to her that matters. The use of declaratives gives Eric a sense of conviction, and that's something he doesn't have at the beginning of the play. He's quite awkward at the beginning. He lets his father interrupt him. And here what he's doing is he's placing value on Eva Smith over the money that he stole, recognising her worth and the respect that she deserved. It's really a powerful image, and I think, again, it's one that is sometimes overlooked. At the end of the play, we see a male and female character, Eric and Sheila, standing side by side in union. They represent Priestley's hope for the future, that men and women will stand as equals and fight together against the injustices so deeply ingrained in what he believes is a society that was created ultimately by capitalism. So those are my ideas. Of course, at the end of your essay, you'll want to draw this all to a close and really think about the ultimate aim of Priestley. And personally, I think it's these two main things. I think he wanted to demonstrate how the patriarchal structure suppressed women. And, he's overall advocating for social change and greater equality. And through that, he's, not only focusing on the capitalist system, but also attacking the patriarchal system as well that's in place in 1912. I'd love to hear your own thoughts. Please feel free to share your own ideas in the comments section, and you're always more than welcome to reach out to me directly at mrsrumsey@mrsrumsey.com.